Hi, everybody. Welcome to Mormonish Podcast. I'm Rebecca, and I have once again with me my favorite alternate co-host, Unoriginal Jim. How are you, Unoriginal Jim?
Good. Keeping warm. It's finally over 17 degrees here today, so
You
we're in good.
are in one of those areas where you're just completely snowed in, right? It's so
Well,
weird
so
in Utah, there's nothing, but
yeah.
everywhere else. Oh my gosh. How, are you surviving?
Well, so it was really weird because I was actually out in Missouri for a family issue just before this storm hit, and I left early and cannonballed it home through St. Louis, through Louisville. Got home. The snow starts falling. We're expecting 12 inches, 6 inches. Instead, we got 4 inches of sleet and then 3 layers of ice. So everything was just iced in.
Oh,
Now, down south of us in Tennessee, Tennessee got rocked. Like Nashville is just torn apart right now. So we had a snowstorm, an ice storm like that in 2021. And most of our county area and into West Virginia was without power for 3 weeks.
oh
So
my gosh.
but we're good. We came out of the house yesterday, went to the gym for the first time in a while, and so
You
we're
ventured out. You because I've
yep.
seen those videos of cars just like they cannot stop and they're piling up, and that is so scary. Oh my goodness. It's like just stay home.
Yep. No, I actually hate winter. I hated the winter when we lived in Utah, and when we relocated, I tried really hard to get a job that wasn't where snow is.
Right.
I ended up in Kentucky, so we get less snow, but we get a lot of ice, so it's not
Yeah.
terrible.
No, ice is bad too. Well, I'm glad that your internet's working, and I'm glad that you're safe and warm and you have a nice beverage there, because we have a
Yeah.
really interesting podcast today for everybody. Jim and I have been talking about this for a couple weeks, because there's been, some articles kind of about this. There's an article from the past that we're going to dig into, but it's a topic that both of us can get really, I don't know, what would you say? I don't want to
Oh,
say
I'm gonna get
angry, just
it's
so disappointed, so we're going to try to keep it very level, and go through the information, go through the quotes and things like that. But if we do get a little snarky about it, it's just because this is one of those things that you just have to shake your head and say, come on. So we'll let Jim just kick us off and introduce all of this. He's put all this together and done an incredible job. And I think you guys are going to find this incredibly interesting. A lot of this stuff and things you may have heard before, but then there's a lot of stuff you haven't that's extremely relevant. So I think it's going to be great.
So yeah, you're right. I have to laugh at myself a little bit because I was reviewing. I haven't looked at these slides in a week, and I went back to look at the last. And as I get to like the last four slides, I can tell I was angry when I wrote them.
Yeah.
So I had to go back and
You have to
do some re-editing
soften
because
them.
yeah. So I like how John Delin's always like we're going to be as even keeled and neutral as possible,
Yeah.
and then like he ends up not being neutral, right? That's exactly how I'm going to be today.
Yeah, it's hard.
So when I was when I lost my job years ago, we lost our house in North Salt Lake. We ended up having to relocate to Kentucky because that was the only job I could get. And it was been a huge blessing being here, right? Just tremendous. But I was sitting in my bishop's office and I had a kid. One of my sons had been burned very badly. And so he was in the hospital every single week having surgery for 2 years. And so it was a very, very difficult situation. And I remember sitting in my bishop's office, and I told him, I said, look, I can't pay tithing. You know, I went from a job where I was making X amount. Now we're living in subsidized housing. It was a very bad year for us. And his response to me was, well, you should just pray that you can make more money so you can pay tithing. And I remember getting up out of that office fuming. I was so angry because here I was doing everything I could, everything I knew how to do. My wife had just had a baby. Our youngest son had a caustic ingestion, which is where he swallowed lye. And everything was a struggle. And I was being told, well, sorry, you can't have your temple recommend you're not paying tithing.
Gosh.
And that was really it for me. But that brings us to we've all heard that narrative. And what we're going to do today is we're going to take a look at how that narrative exists in the US, how it's been taught, how we've heard it. And then we're going to take a look at how that tithing narrative of you can't afford not to pay tithing is broadcast to the poorest of the human population. We're talking the most destitute populations in West Africa. And I pulled this information from the church's West Africa website. So the presentation We're going to go through, we're going to talk about not only what they said, right? But how does what they're saying benefit the institution, and how do the poor end up paying for it? Okay. Um, and coming from where I live, so I live in Appalachia, right? And the Hatfield and the McCoys took place 20 miles from me. The West Virginia mine wars, where the government actually dropped bombs on U.S. citizens for striking instead of working for the mining companies, takes place just south of me here. Generational poverty is real. Okay, it's a very economically hard area, and so when I drive around and I meet people, the more I learn about the hardships that they go through in this region, it makes me hate this teaching all the more, because it just gets more and more pernicious when you have an institution that has billions of dollars going in and telling people you have to pay this so that you can get the subjective blessings that we're not going to tell you what they actually are, right? So if you have any thoughts on that, we'll go to the first slide.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think it's interesting. It almost every single day I see a post on Faithful social media where somebody says, I'm in a scenario, something maybe like what you described, and I went to the church and I thought, right? I thought there would be help for me there in this dire emergency because I've always been a tithe payer. And in many cases, there's not. And that is a huge shelf breaker. I really believe that so many faithful Mormons are so proud of the church and their wealth because they feel somehow, well, they are a part of it because they paid into it, but they feel
Right.
somehow that it's a safety net for them. It's going to be there. But, and some of that's roulette, that kind of stuff. But for the most part, it's not. They really want you, to in a limited way, take advantage of those resources and then move on. They are not there for you. So it's a big eye opener that I see people experiencing almost every day and posting about it on social media. And they're shocked that there isn't the help they thought would be there.
Yeah. And the thing is, when you start dealing with people's money, right, that is what they buy their food with. That's how they pay their bills. When you start dealing with people's ability to provide for themselves, you are dealing with the very core of their temporal existence, right? It's very, very difficult to do that and have people feel comfortable and safe. And unfortunately, the way this is set up is pay your tithing before you pay for anything else actually removes elements of interpersonal security that people have in their own self-sufficiency, and instead takes that and offloads that responsibility onto God. And every existence with God is a subjective experience, right?
Yes.
So that's one of the things we see here. So this idea of the poor can't afford to not pay tithing. Across these prophetic teachings, right? I have a whole bunch of them that we pulled in. We're going to see a number of common threads. Okay. The first is the church teachings tend to reframe poverty as a spiritual failure. Okay. It redefines obedience as the solution, right? So you are struggling, you have hardship, your family doesn't get along, you are, all this other stuff. Did you pay your tithing?
Yeah.
Oh, no. Well, you should pay your tithing. Obedience becomes the mechanism for fixing the spiritual failure. What we get from the church when it comes to tithing is vague, unverifiable concepts of blessings. The Lord will open the gates of heaven. He'll do all this stuff. We get tales of people who have paid tithing and then experienced something, right, that kind of fixed their issue, and they view what happened to them through the lens of payment. Okay, that is a subjective interpretation. It is untestable. There is no mechanism that you can quantify that say paying of tithing equaled X outcome. Okay, so it's all hearsay. All right, but it's marketed in a way that makes you feel that those people had faith, and if you had done more, you would have the experience, and it would fix your faith too. So people in hardship who want that experience will pay the tithing and then view whatever outcomes come down the road as the answer to paying tithing. Even if the outcome is negative, it's the Lord was giving us an extended trial.
Well, yeah,
right?
You can connect any dots, and human beings just do that. If you're looking for a miracle, you will connect dots to a miracle. I once read some advice that said, if you really want to test tithing, don't pay it for 3 months and write down everything that happens. Look, I got this unexpected check in the mail, or, oh no, I have a car payment that, doubled, and then pay tithing for 3 months and write down everything that happens. It's all going to be the same. It's just life. Amazing things happen. Coincidental things happen. things that suck happen money wise, but it's all just life. But you can connect any dots in your mind that you need to make yourself feel better. And that's what human beings do.
Yeah, it's financial paranoia. I think that's the word where you look at something and you see it. So if you look at the clouds and you see a mouse, the mouse doesn't actually exist.
Right.
You are imposing what you interpret on the cloud, right?
Yeah.
So because we get these vague, unverifiable blessings, the church has no responsibility to actually deliver anything. It receives a tangible object from the membership, something that it can quantify. It knows how much you've paid in. But what you get is this vague, unverifiable responsibility that's been shifted off to God. Well, God will do it in his way, in his time. You just give us that money, okay? This removes any sort of any form of institutional accountability for anything the church says, because automatically they represent God. God acts in his own way. They're just there to facilitate the transaction, okay? And we moralize. I'm not going to say we. Wow, the church moralizes.
I say we all the time. Still, it's okay. Yeah. I like this last one. This is
They moralize non-payment as theft, and I'm going to tear into that at the end because that really makes me mad. But non-payment, so the poor not paying their money into the institution becomes theft, selfishness, and even rebellion.
Yeah. Would a man rob God? Look at all the quotes and things about tithing like that. Would you rob God? I can't afford not to. It's fire insurance. It's scary, right? You're also doing something immoral by robbing God. I mean, when I look back at the way tithing has been presented, and I remember in college, the guys you would date were like, yeah, I want to be able to be a huge tithe payer, right? So they're basically saying, I intend to be wealthy and I intend to pay so much tithing, right? And everyone's like, oh, yeah.
Well, I never dated guys at college. So
I'm assuming some girls might have said that to you too. Yeah, it was the patriarchy in the 80s when I was in college, right? And everybody wanted to flex their tithing muscle to you and say, I intend to be a really big tithe payer.
Yeah, I'd love to be in that conversation. Look at the size of his tithing check.
Tithing donation? Yeah.
So what we get at the end of all this is within the church, we have this closed moral economy where the church always wins. They always have a tangible outcome for every interaction. The poor always bear the risk. They are always the one giving their money over for something that is subjective and unverifiable. The outcomes are never actually testable. The only testable element in all of this dynamic is the amount of money given by the individual to the institution. Doubt is redefined as insufficient faith. And in my opinion, this is better defined as institutional religious financial manipulation, right? Because that's exactly what it is. The message is always geared to get you to deliver the money before you ever receive anything in return. It's a transactional religion, but in this transaction, it is completely bankrupt. Okay, let's get to the good stuff. Spencer W. Kimball, one of the, I remember as a kid having to read this book, right? It was on the bookshelf in the house, and we were homeschooled for a while, and we had to read this. So what we're going to do is we're going to move through these tithing payments from the 1970s to the most recent, and then we're going to transition into what was taught in Africa in 2017, 2018. And what you'll find is what we have in the U.S. teaching is a pretty offensive standard. When you get to Africa, it is actually conditioned as paying rent to God. They say tithing is rent you pay to live on earth. Okay.
Yeah. And that's so offensive, like you say. That is just, but it's interesting you bring up Kimball because I think, Windows of Heaven, remember that movie came out in the early 60s. So people like my parents' age,
the Lorenzo Snow one, right?
Heavy tithing, that was their thing. That was their mantra. That was the drum that they beat because they were the ones that got caught in that. The church was in debt and they needed tithe payers. And so they hit that hard. So people of a certain age like me were raised just with intense tithing pressure the whole time. I mean, I can't even tell you, I had to take my tithing jar down to Christmas morning in case somebody gave me a $10 bill. My mom had money to change it right there. I'm talking intense pressure. But once I kind of learned the context of when they were born, when my parents were young, married, tithing was it. And Kimball's part of this in the 70s and the 80s. They just hit this so hard. You just can't even imagine. So
Yeah, no,
these are
I'm gonna laugh
great
because
quotes. I'm glad you put these all together. And yes, I can see them. It's always a question for me, so I can help you read.
all right. Well, I'll throw a couple your way. So this
Perfect.
first one is, for those who are listening, this is Spencer W. Kimball. He says the poor have a special need to tithe. There are poor who say that they cannot afford to pay tithing because their incomes are small. There are people who need the bless no sorry they are people who need the blessings of the Lord. No one is ever too poor to pay tithing, and the Lord has promised that he will open the windows of heaven when we are obedient to his law. He can give us better salaries. He can give us more judgment on the spending of our money. He can give us better health. He can give us greater understanding so that we can get better positions. So,
Prosperity gospel. There it
bingo.
is. Your
There is
health.
so
Your
much to
wealth.
unpack.
Oh my gosh.
This quote is a podcast in and of itself, but we're going to break this down. But first, let's point out their incomes are small, but look at all the things that God can give us. Now, these are all things that people attain on their own. People who are not associated with Mormonism in any way, shape, or form all attain these exact same outcomes, right? But you can only attain them within Mormonism if you pay the fee. So let's go to the next slide here. And then he goes on. He says, "Let the children see parents pay tithing." So wouldn't it be wonderful if every father in Zion would take his children with him to pay his tithing and let them see him give the bishop the amount of money that represents sacrifice to him, so that the children would also feel the need of it. The principle of tithing is a solution for poverty. Okay, that gets huge. I'm gonna go walk through that.
Yeah, my
So
parents did that. They always took me with them whenever they went to tithing settlement or handed that envelope. And I remember, and I've talked about this before. This is how I know I was a little atheist when I was like 4 or 5. My dad hands the tithing envelope to the bishop. And I remember walking away and I go, how do we know he's not just going to steal it? I mean, he's just a guy. What's he going to do with it? And my dad's laughing, ha, ha, ha. He tells that story as a funny story. I'm like, oh no, I was a little critical thinker because, yeah, what is happening with that tithing? And why are you giving that money to just a man? So but boy, I can't even, and you're younger than I am, but boy, tithing was hammered, hammered, hammered. It just was decade after decade.
Well, yeah, I was taught the exact same thing. I was taught one of the things I was taught. So growing up in Missouri, where we were, Adirondack is right up Route 13 from where I graduated college. Okay,
Yeah,
so I did.
just there.
Yep, and it's so boring. The coolest thing that ever happened to me there is I caught a snapping turtle once, like 20 years ago. But anyway, so I was taught the Alvin R. Dyer concept that tithing is actually the metric that God uses to see who gets inheritances in Zion and how big your inheritance is going to be. So that's what was driven through to me. So let's talk about this statement from Kimball. This is a denial of economic reality. This is the church substituting one concept where actual economics should live in people's minds, right? When basic survival for members of the church is reframed as less important than institutional obedience, the institution has positioned its value over food, shelter, and health. Okay, that is the message to members that you can take from this. Our subjective blessings, this idea that God can give you a better position, that if, like I was told, you pray to make more money to make tithing, becomes a carrot on a stick. Okay, Kimball lists better salaries. He gives us better health, better judgment, and better opportunities. Now, I remember in Sunday school being taught that if you paid your tithing and you were still behind in money, God could make the money in your bank account last longer. And the teacher couldn't tell us how, but that it was a miracle and that she had seen it many times where the money that she needed was there, even though she was really behind, right? And I remember as a kid thinking, but there's a fixed amount. in the bank account. Like I knew how that worked, but that's one of the messages that we were taught.
You were a critical thinker too, absolutely. But and you see all the time where other people will help somebody that they know is in need. I remember reading a post of a daughter who said, "Oh, I knew my parents, they needed help, they needed money. I've left the church. I slipped a check anonymously under their door," and it became a tithing story. Their daughter actually gave them the money, but it became a tithing story. The Lord gave them the money. No, it was an ex-Mormon.
Yep. So these ideas, like I said, so better salaries, health, judgment, subjective to personal interpretation, unmeasurable, and not guaranteed. Okay. This allows for any form of retroactive interpretation an individual can place on it. So if life improves, tithing worked for you. If life gets worse, God is testing you. If nothing changes, you have spiritual blessings that you have to recognize, right?
They can't lose. There's no way they can lose. Every base is covered.
That's right. So we all had one of these little tithing boxes.
Yeah.
I had one of these for years. Mine was red. My brother's was blue. And mine never had any money in it because I kept taking it. So we lived in Gig Harbor, Washington, and I would always take the money and go down to Kelly's Toy Store down there by the pier.
Love Gig Harbor. That's
yeah. So this is conditioning children to pay. All right. So this is, if you watched any of my TikToks, I've been really hard recently on this idea of cultural conditioning within Mormonism. So I just put up a video the other day talking about how baptism itself is a violation of the concept of free will, because we're not giving people the ability to choose. We're conditioning them for a form of action. Right. So teaching children to tithe conditions them under the idea that they are paying for blessings, that this is a transactional relationship with God, right? And they're being taught these ideas before consent or critical thought is even developed. No kids, can really sit back and think through what are the implications of the institution teaching me this, right? And children will associate the payment of money with obedience. And we sit here and we wonder why so many narcissistic men exist in Utah. These guys who run these businesses into the ground and form it on some sort of righteousness. Like they'll sit there at these conferences where they teach people about real estate and they like to mix the gospel in with it, right? Exactly. It's because of this. They were conditioned to view money in terms of religious piety, right? And it internalizes guilt for non-payment before kids have the autonomy to choose whether or not they want to give. And this is pre-rational conditioning on kids. This eliminates informed consent and puts them into a worldview where they really can't choose for themselves to begin with, right? The church says you have the freedom to choose, but at the same time it says if you choose wrong, you're bad, right?
No, the conditioning was heavy. And I have so many stories like that. I remember one time I made change out of my tithing jar, like change. Like I needed, the same amount of money was in the tithing jar. And my mom said, you're robbing God. That's his money once you put it in the jar. I'm like, yeah, but I'm exchanging 4 quarters for $1. Does not matter. And I just feel like that is something, it's so hard to let go of. It's like the last thing that you let go of is paying that tithing. You are so conditioned. I remember even when I was hardly attending, I was hardly doing anything. End of the year, like last couple of days, I'd be like, oh, I guess I should just, and I'd quickly just make an, online payment. I can't believe I did that. I want that back because it was ridiculous. I wasn't even trying to get a temple recommend, but I was still paying a little bit of tithing. And when people step away, they're always like garments and tithing. That's it. Once they cut those cords, those are the cords that you're super conditioned, and it means everything, right? Once that's gone, then, you're kind of free to move on your own path. But yeah, conditioning is
I kept strong. All the garments in my garment drawer for 8 years.
Yeah.
I just had a drawer. I didn't do anything with it. I never touched it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Same thing.
It's just like that. Yep.
All right. So let's go back to 1986. Back when Bon Jovi was awesome.
Yes.
And it says
music in the 80s.
This is Robert D. Hales when he was still auditioning for the Quorum of the 12. It says the law of tithing is part of a celestial law which we must live if we are to attain eternal life and exaltation in the celestial kingdom. Okay, so right there, payment of tithing is tied to the highest blessings that God can possibly give. You do not pay, you do not qualify for what God says is free to everybody, right? Paying tithing helps to qualify us to receive the higher ordinances of the priesthood. To qualify for eternal life, a person must receive the ordinances of the priesthood administered in the house of the Lord. Tithing is one of the basic standards of judgment by which it is determined whether a person is worthy to receive these ordinances. The law of tithing is a test by which people as individuals shall be proved. And any man who fails to observe this principle shall be known as a man who is indifferent to the welfare of Zion and who neglects his duty as a member of the church. He neglects to do that which would entitle him to receive the blessings and the ordinance of the gospel, right? So that's Robert D. Hales. That second half of the quote is him quoting Joseph F. Smith.
Mm-hmm.
So right here, this is a transactional relationship. If you do not pay X amount of money, you cannot receive what God would give you. Okay. Now, this has always interested me, right? Because what constitutes what money is a language of value, right? So what constitutes money, what people used to pay, is different from culture to culture, right? And it used to be that people would pay tithing in goods, right? They would, when they had the Dixie wine mission, the winemakers in Utah would pay their tithing in wine grapes and wine, and the church would sell the wine, right? But the idea that the Lord has established that you cannot receive any form of exaltation and that your financial contribution to a temporal institution is the key by which you will be judged worthy to receive blessings forever is a concept that is designed always to benefit the institution before the individual, like we've talked about.
No, well, there's a reason they have tithing, settlement when we were younger, declaration, yep. Right? There's nothing else that they call you in to specifically talk to you about, like how kind are you to your neighbors or how well do you treat other people? There's no that kind of declaration. It's financial. It's a financial declaration that you have to make. Right. So that's what they care about.
He says, I think when people say that they haven't enough money to pay tithing, they should say they haven't enough faith to pay tithing. It is my conviction that we pay tithing with faith and not with money. But you can't express it in faith. You can only express it with money. Let's just insert that in there. Because when a man has so much money, when a man has so much money that he has a large tithing, but he can't pay tithing. He has too much money and too little faith to pay tithing. He just feels like he can't afford it. I would add that some of the less fortunate have too little money and too little faith. And also, they feel they can't afford to pay tithing. No one is too rich or too poor to pay tithing. No one can afford not to pay tithing.
Yeah, there's that mighty line, right? You can't afford not to pay. And we've had, accountants on before on Mormonish who have shown that, yes, certain incomes, it's maybe a slight inconvenience. Other incomes to pay tithing, you are going without necessities and things like that. And it's sort of a sliding scale. It's very interesting when you do the matrix on it.
I have a chart that I developed that shows what the average income is for African saints in these countries and how much their income constitutes per month. And we're talking about the levels of poverty, which we're going to be looking at here in just a second. It is incredibly substantial. So everybody knows this one. This quote has made its rounds around Reddit. Everybody's seen it. We're going to go through this one real fast. This is Lynn G. Robbins of the 70. He says, no bishop, no missionary should ever hesitate or lack the faith. So if you don't tell people to pay tithing, you lack faith. Okay. If you have a guilty conscience on asking somebody who is in rural Appalachia, who lives off of $26,000 a year and has, and has, cancer or whatever, you don't have faith enough to tell them to pay money to the institution. The sentiment of they can't afford to needs to be replaced with they can't afford not to. One of the first things a bishop must do is to help the needy is to ask them to pay their tithing. Like the widow, if a destitute family is faced with the decision of paying their tithing or eating, they should pay their tithing. The bishop can help them with the food and other basic needs until they become self-reliant. Now, this is extremely problematic because it may be possible in Utah for someone to go to the bishop and go to the bishop storehouse that day. When you are where I live, the nearest bishop storehouse is Cincinnati or Columbus. It is hours away. Okay? Secondly, You are taking away from people what they have to provide for themselves, and then you are adding a level of error into the process. Okay. So anybody who knows how to think through a process-based system, okay, the more steps you add, the more prone you are to finding a failure somewhere. There's going to be a pinch point. Okay. So what the church does is you give us your money, then we're going to have Brother Robbins. He's going to get with you. He's going to get a list of what you need, and he will go get what you need. So you are limited to the options that you give Brother Robbins. On another occasion, they say, you give us your money and we'll pay your bills. You give your bills to us. But now you are reliant upon brother so and so in your ward to be on top of it to pay your bills. That's not self-reliance,
No, there's
right?
also a worthiness option too that comes in there. You have the money to pay your bills or to buy food, you give it away, and then you have to be sort of scrutinized in some cases. Will you come clean the church? Then we'll give you food. Or are you worthy?
That does
Then we'll
happen.
give you
Yes.
food. So it removes autonomy from a person and makes it, it's just sort of a vague option that it removes control, basically, is what it is.
And
It
it's
removes control.
exploitation.
Yeah.
It is pure religious exploitation. So
Yeah.
this explicitly instructs families to prioritize the institution over their own survival. Okay. Now people will say, "Oh, you're being ridiculous. It's not actually their survival." But that thought process literally is do I pay for myself with what I have, or do I give what I have to the church and hope that they cover it? Okay. It reframes hunger and family economic hardship as something that is acceptable as a sign of sacrifice. Your kids should go without so that you can show the institution how loyal you are. Okay? It promises temporary institutional aid, which keeps members dependent upon the institution itself. It reinforces the authority of the institution over the members, and it requires continued obedience to local and regional leadership. If you are getting something from the church and you have a break from the church, which means you no longer sustain your bishop or you no longer get along, guess what? Your support system vanishes. You no longer have access to the support system, but they still have your money. Okay? And it introduces this increased risk of missed bills by outsourcing personal responsibility onto voluntold ward members who may not even care about the calling that they're doing. Right? So for me, and I'm going to use the C word, this is a cult control system where scarcity is maintained, relief is conditional, and loyalty is rewarded with survival and even praise. Okay. And I don't like to use the C word because I don't think it's always applicable. But when it comes to institutions that put layers of control on people's ability to subsist, that I think is absolutely the correct word.
Yep, I agree.
Okay. So let's talk about West Africa. So we're going to go in and we're going to start talking about some numbers, talk about what the actual conditions are. And Rebecca, I took a note from you in this presentation. I went nuts on AI one night.
It's so fun. I'm sorry.
It's terrible. And I have a brother who's an artist, right? I have lots of friends who are artists and they hate AI. But I can't afford to pay somebody to make this, and I suck at computers in general. So all right. So what we're going to look at now is a series of messages that were delivered to the Africa West area in 2017, 2018, and 2019. Okay, so the countries that we're looking at are some of the most poverty stricken in the entire world, right? So in the West Africa region, there's Chad, there's Gambia, there's Ghana, there's Guinea, there's Liberia, there's Niger, there's Nigeria, there's Senegal, Sierra Leone, Togo, Western Sahara. The church has established units in all of these areas, okay? And so it is, an area where the church is growing. So we talked earlier about some of these press releases coming out of Africa where they have 100 people were baptized in a day and 300 people were baptized in a day, right? The church is taking advantage, very brutal advantage of the economic and poverty conditions in this area for its PR campaigns. These people are being baptized into an institution that is taking their money and then using them to paint an image of growth where growth does not exist. Okay, we'll talk about that here in a second. Let's see here. All right. So Africa is the poorest continent on Earth. The competition is not even particularly close for other countries. Even if you compare it to South America, the conditions in Africa are substantially worse, and the percentages of the population that live in poverty are far worse. Not even poverty. We're talking extreme poverty where people subsist off of less than even $1 a day. Okay. Economic insecurity, political instability, political corruption, civil wars, ethnic cleansing, terrorism, terrorist insurrections have left millions of Africans over the last decades and century living in abject poverty, not even paycheck to paycheck, just on bare subsistence. Out of the 26 countries ranked by the World Bank as low income, 22 of them alone are in Africa. Okay. These rankings refer to the very poorest countries in the entire world, and Africa also includes 23 of the world's 54 lower middle income countries. Okay. So very little financial availability. Education is not robust. Access to information that we take for granted does not exist. And so the messaging that's going to go in there is going to go in basically to a blank slate. The people in Africa, in terms of the church's message, are a blank slate where the church can present any message it wants without much pushback because they don't have access to the tools or history that we have here. And that means that institutions can take advantage of those populations very, very readily. And in my opinion, they are. Okay, so let's take a look at the countries in the West Africa area. So, let's see here. Whoops, nope, back. I'm not talented. Okay, so the most recent comparative indicators based on the World Bank's extreme poverty rates show that many of these countries rank in the world's poorest nations by the share of people living on a very, very low daily income. So in Niger alone, 60% of the population lives below $3 per day. Okay. In Chad, nearly 40% of the population lives below $3 per day. Okay. Gambia, 22% of the population. So you can see what we're talking about here. Extreme poverty. We spend more on a cup of coffee in the morning on a Tuesday than these people make in a day.
Right. And that's where the percentages come in, because if you're giving 30 cents out of $3, that's a big difference. If you're giving your 10% of, $80,000 or whatever. I mean, when you're talking about what you can afford and how you can live. So yeah, the metrics are really skewed.
Yeah.
So that
tithing is very
devastating.
Yeah. Tithing is very, very easy for somebody living in Lehigh.
Yeah.
Okay.
Exactly.
If you're living in Lehigh and you own a bunch of Airbnbs, it's very easy for you to write that check. If you are living in Senegal and you have nothing, and that 30 cents is, basically your kid's food for the next 3 days, they're going to brand this as, look at the sacrifice of these righteous people. I'm going to brand it as, look at the gluttony of this institution, because these blessings, if this is God's institution, these blessings should be coming downwards from the top where the resources are, not coming up from the bottom where the resources don't exist.
Yep.
Right. And this is where I start to get angry, because I'm already starting to get mad.
I know. I warned everybody we might get a little angry, because this is it's frustrating when we talk about the US and how we were all raised. But when you talk about this,
this gets worse. It gets so much worse.
Very frustrating.
Young people in Africa bear the brunt of this poverty. Okay, so across the continent as a whole, children as a defined group of anybody under the age of 18 are overrepresented amongst every single group of poor classes. Okay, children aged 0 to 9 constitute 31% of the population, but make up 38% of the poor population. Okay, so very, very much overrepresented. So every dollar that comes out of these communities is money that's coming away from the kids who make up the poorest of the poor. When combined with children aged 10 to 17, they constitute 50% of Africa's population, but they constitute 57% of Africa's poor. Okay, and so we have 340 million African children under the age of 18 are poor, and 225 million of them are under the age of 10.
Yeah, I had just read that stat about how young the population of Africa is. And I realized when you look at those mass baptisms pictures, they're mostly kids, right? That's who they're baptizing.
Yeah. And think about the optics of this, right? You have these children who are overrepresented in the poverty groups, and you have this rich, this powerful institution that comes into your village and they bring these big humanitarian. I worked at the Bishop Storehouse for a long time. I remember the humanitarian aid boxes, and they would be on pallets. And we
Mhm.
were right there off of Redwood Road. And there was this entire warehouse that was just filled with these humanitarian aid pallets. So you have this institution that comes in, and the people that show up are different, and they're well dressed, and they're clean, and they speak to you, and they have gifts, and they have stuff for your village. Of course, you are going to move to be aligned with that because that institution shows some sort of security, right? It is something that is different, something that has something that you do not. All right. So that's where these baptisms are coming from. These baptisms are not coming from the fact that, oh my gosh, look, the gospel is true. It's look at the resources that
Yeah.
these people from the West are bringing into our community. That's okay. Sorry. I'm going to get worked up again. Let's move on.
No,
Um,
but you can understand why it's attractive. You can understand,
yeah.
you know,
No,
at first
you
at
totally get
least.
it.
Yeah.
So let's talk about what 10% of the yearly income would be approximately, right? So using our GDP per capita proxy as a yearly income. So these numbers illustrate what 10% of the average annual income loosely equates to on a GDP per person in these countries. Okay. So let's take Chad. Okay, the GDP is average about $1,000. Okay. That means these people are paying somewhere around $8 a month
Hmm.
to be for the blessings of being told by the church that they have access to blessings. Okay. Gambia, they're paying about $26 a month. But these are such paltry numbers, right? I mean, look at the amount that they're actually paying. 10% of the yearly income makes $35. The church makes more in a split second on interest
Like that.
than it takes out of these people, and yet it still takes.
No, because
It
it's
still
not
takes
about
their
the
money.
money. It's not about the money. That's the whole point.
It's about the concept of control. It's
Yes.
about being able to tell people if you don't pay us the money, you will lose
Yeah.
something that you can't quantify. And I'm gonna show you that because we're gonna get into the messaging here.
I mean, think about it.
All
It
right.
can be as extreme as you don't pay tithing. You can't have a temple recommend. I mean, I've told the story how my BYU job and temple recommend were threatened when I said I was a partial tithe payer, but not being able to go to the temple, they are threatening families are forever. I mean,
Mhm.
that's what they're willing to put on the chopping block for that control, all of that they say they care about so much, but it's expendable if you're not paying,
Yep.
which
Yeah.
is
What was it?
really
The whole
terrifying.
concept of don't be the break in the chain that stops your family from coming together where
Exactly.
conferences
And if
go.
you don't pay your tithing, you're that break in the chain. That's exactly
Yep.
right.
So let's talk about some colonialism because we're going to get right down into that. So Russell Nelson went to Kenya in 2018. I know Kenya is not on the list of our countries, but the message is the same, right? And he does two things. First, he tells people that tithing is the way to break poverty cycles, and there is no economic metric in any sense of reality that paying money into an institution breaks cultural poverty cycles where you have cultural poverty on a national scale, right? And then he goes and says, by the way, all of your marriage traditions, everything your family has done for generations, your entire culture is insufficient, and we're going to replace that with temple marriage. Okay, so Nelson, 2018. You want to read those quotes?
Yeah, let's see. The title says dowry is not the Lord's way. In Kenya, LDS President Nelson says tithing breaks the poverty cycle. They also claim that temples break the poverty cycle, which is interesting too. So, he says, we preach tithing to the poor people of the world because the poor people of the world have had cycles of poverty generation after generation. He said that same poverty continues from one generation to another until people pay their tithing. It's on you, right? The law of the tithe was followed by ancient peoples as taught by the Old Testament prophets. LDS faithful believe God restored the law and its blessings for those who follow it by giving 1/10 of their income to the church.
Okay. So here, Nelson condemns. So okay, we're gonna get back to that. Let's carry on with the rest of this concept. Nelson condemns dowry bride price customs as not the Lord's way. And by doing so, you have this Western institution that is coming in to an indigenous population and saying, your local tradition is not okay with us. So you are going to turn your back on it if you want the blessings from God. Okay. So replacing indigenous traditions with LDS temple marriage, it introduces a concept which is controlled by the church, not by the community and not by the people. It is conditional upon a worthiness which is instituted by an institution over indigenous populations rather than indigenous populations setting their own conditions for worthiness. And it is conditional on financial obligations paid by an indigenous population to an institution that is not local, right? It is no responsibility to the local population at all. Okay. You're not paying it to your village elder. You're not paying it to, a community organization that where that money stays within the institution. You're paying it to an institution that sends it to Salt Lake and then sends you a paltry amount back and tells you how grateful you should be that you received it.
Yeah, and dowry is a big deal. They are involved in legislation in Philippines too because they've got to get people married. They have to get people married because that's the Mormon model. It doesn't work unless you're legally married, and then you can go to the temple and do all the things. But in countries where that, for whatever reason, is not as important, or you all live together, or you have different ways that you do things, it doesn't work. So they've got to make sure that they control it so it works.
Yep. So the church has to undermine local traditions to institute a mechanism by which it controls people's relationships. And they do that by basically saying you have to pay to have access to these blessings that only we can give you. Okay. Your community, your traditions, none of that matters. That's colonialism. That is instituting something for the purpose of whitewashing and destroying tradition so you can replace it with something you can control and define. Okay. This replaces local economic obligations and traditions with external institution financial obligations and control, while presenting the latter as morally superior. What we give you via tithing is morally superior to what you and your family traditions have had for generations. That same poverty continues until people pay their tithing. Okay, so let's break this down. This is a moralization of poverty. In Nelson's design here, poverty is not structural. It's not the result of economic strife. It's not the result of generational cultural issues, and it's not tied to local political control or abuse. It is a failure to pay God or the church in the place of God. It is ethically manipulative because essentially he is blaming the victims for their own poverty.
Yep.
That same poverty will continue until you pay your tithing. You are victimizing yourself. It diminishes non-religious explanations for why these things happen. Okay? And in reality, because religion is subjective, you can quantify the impacts of political strife. You can quantify the impacts of economic turmoil. You cannot quantify the impact of religious explanations, right? And it frames tithing as the only form of escape which people will come to eventually. There is no defined outcome. It's when people pay their tithing, this poverty goes away. There's no evidence that that's even the case, and they can't provide it. But it's extremely manipulative because what they're doing is saying your salvation, the salvation of your family, all of your well-being is tied to us. You need us, and we can ameliorate your poverty eventually if you just keep paying us. But we're not going to give you any kind of outcomes.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of churches in Christianity base themselves on prosperity gospel, and it works. Everybody wants to have hope, right? Yep. Send us your money, get this tier of Jesus, and once you have it, once it's mailed to you, then everything's going to change. Human beings are hardwired to just have hope, especially when you have circumstances that are less than hopeful. So I understand it. They play on the human condition, and it works.
Yep. And that's exactly what they're doing here. So in this case, this whole narrative always benefits the institution before it benefits any individual. Yep. The church will take credit for any good outcomes that it did not cause. It bears zero responsibility for failed outcomes, and anecdotes replace quantifiable evidence. There is no empirical evidence that tithing lifts people out of poverty. Zero. There's no controlled studies. There's no causal data. It doesn't exist because tithing doesn't do that. There's only stories that are always selectively positive, but never actually representative of anything, right? They're emotional. They're tied to, sister so-and-so, and we'll get into some of those. This message from the church is selling people hope without any form of accountability on the part of the institution. So in 2017, the church takes that concept, right, that formula, and pushes on the Saints of West Africa a series of posts and articles and speeches. And there were 4 specific ones just within that year alone. And we're going to take a look at, I think, 3 of these. Okay. But this is all from the Africa West website. These do not show up on the main LDS page. You have to go to the Africa West page to get these. Okay.
Yep.
So the first is tithing, a gift from a loving heavenly Father. Now, this one, when I first read it, I was stunned. This talk, given by Terrence M. Vinson, who was the area president, I believe, at the time, goes through and explains to the people of West Africa that tithing is not just something you do, it is rent that you are paying God to live on earth, and it is a debt to be paid. So it takes this idea of rent and this talk from Jeffrey R. Holland about how it's a debt, how you are in debt for tithing when you're born, and combines them into telling the poorest of the poor that they have to pay rent on their very existence to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in cash only. So, message to the African saints. Okay, the first is tithing is rent to the Lord for our occupation on his creation and represents interest on the capital that the Lord has lent us, air to breathe, water and food to sustain us, and the abilities he has given us, the bodies he created for us. And our failure to pay a full tithe is really robbing God. Now take a second and let's step out of our privileged position and put ourselves into a village where we have nothing. And then consider this message coming from people who we view to be in positions of power. Okay? This is the rest of the quote. In the October 2001 General Conference, Jeffrey R. Holland said, paying tithing is not a token gift we are somehow charitably bestowing upon God. Paying tithing is discharging a debt. Elder Talmage once described as a contract between us and the Lord. I'm not going to read the rest of that quote. People can pause this if they want to. But so here we have a population in abject poverty being told that the air, they're paying rent on the air. And they may not even have a concept of rent. This is one of the things that bothers me the most about this.
Or capital or any of that. That's
indigenous populations who have no money, have no concept, or may not have a concept of how to interpret these ideas, because these are very Western ideas. Right. And so they're introducing a concept that is actually maybe entirely lost. The second part of this talk was our tithing should be the very first thing we set aside to pay before anything else. And he says prioritizing paying our tithes is reflected in the words of the Savior. Heavenly Father knoweth that ye have need of all things, but seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all things shall be added unto you. For our publication, The Strengths of Youth Councils, paying tithing first, even when you think you do not have enough money to meet your other needs, doing so will help you develop greater faith, overcome selfishness, because if you don't pay it, you're selfish, and be more receptive to the Spirit. All right? So, like we talked about, the majority of the people being baptized in these images that we've seen are youth. Mm-hmm. They're telling them to go back to this document before it was changed, right? And they're being told, if you don't give us that 38 cents, you are selfish.
That's right.
Okay? Let's go to the next part of the talk. When we pay our tithe, it enables the Lord to bless. The Lord can't bless you because obviously he's not powerful enough to overcome the financial obligations in the transactional relationship.
Right.
So Henry B. Eyring explained aspects of this which we can easily overlook. When we pay our tithe to the church, our Heavenly Father pours out blessings upon us. And anyone who has consistently paid a full tithe knows this is true. Again, back to that subjective, that story, that narrative, that people who do it know it's true, so you should follow their example. The blessings are sometimes spiritual and sometimes temporal. They are given in the Lord's time according to what he knows is best for us.
Loophole.
Exactly.
Loophole. Zero accountability.
So much snaky language. Basically, you give us the money and you're going to get something, but sometimes who knows what it could be?
Yeah. And it's going to be what's best for you, which may be losing everything because you paid tithing and couldn't pay your mortgage. And in the end, that'll be the best thing for you. There's always a way to spin it because
Think of the lessons you learned.
Yeah.
You're like Job.
Exactly. Yep. Yep, that's exactly right. Wow.
And then he
Ugh.
closes by a quote from James E. Faust. Members of the church who do not pay tithing do not lose their membership. They only lose blessings.
Well, they lose
Okay?
their temple recommend, and that means you lose your family in the eternity. So that's a pretty big deal. That's a
Yeah.
pretty big takeaway that they're holding
And
over people's heads.
yeah, and your social status
Yeah.
because you're
And your
not going to
job,
the
like
temple.
me,
Yeah.
I was threatened. Yeah. Like my
That's right. You
job.
can lose your job. That's right. If you're not at BYU. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, no, when I worked at BYU and I confessed to my bishop for some reason that I was a partial tithe payer because I made so little at BYU. And he said, I can't endorse you. And I'm going to have to call your department and tell them they can do what they are going to do, but you may lose your job. So yeah, it's not a joke. I mean, it's real and it's messing with people's real lives.
Yeah. Then he quotes that previous quote by Hales. And then, mind you, he's talking to, the poorest of the poor. Paying tithing helps us to qualify to receive God's higher ordinances, to qualify for eternal
Right.
life.
Right.
Tithing is the basic standard of judgment by which is determined whether a person is worthy. Now, remember, for brief, I'm really good at tangents. I'm going to go off on a quick one. I have been thinking about putting together an entire presentation on the manipulative way the word qualify
Yeah.
is utilized. Because I've gone back and read the New Testament multiple times, okay? Because I genuinely like everything that's not the Pauline epistles, okay? This concept of qualification, you pay, you qualify, or you're striving to qualify, like was in the a young woman's. If you state that you're always trying to qualify, what you're telling people is that they're never actually good enough.
Exactly.
Right? It's that perpetual message of you're always falling short, but you have to have the institution to make up that for you.
Right. Well, and
Um,
this is the problem that the wider Christian community has with Mormonism. This idea that God's not enough, that he can save you. You can't qualify. It has to be God, and somebody explained this to me a long time ago, a Christian friend, because I didn't understand what they were talking about when they kept saying you have all these rules, these stipulations, this qualification. And she's like, if you're in quicksand, you're a Christian, you fall down in, Jesus instantly reaches in and he pulls you out. You don't have to qualify. He loves you. He's powerful. He's able to rescue you like that. If you're a Mormon and you fall into quicksand, you must struggle and swim as hard as you can to the top, barely making it. You're about to die. You're trying to qualify. You're not good enough. You can't do it. And then Jesus will kind of pluck you, from the top after you've struggled all that way. She goes, it's a huge difference. It's a huge difference in how people view God, view their relationship with God, and all of that. And the wider Christian community, which we're trying to become a part of, they don't understand this qualify thing. But Mormonism, they've hung their hat on that in everything, not just tithing.
well, because it is the gatekeeping, right?
Yes,
I'm
it's
going to put it here.
gatekeeping.
It is the way that
Yep.
they gatekeep their authority. So
Yep.
the next presentation, this is actually written by a lady who was the Stake Relief Society president in one of these wards in West Africa, right? Not paying tithing is the cause of hardship, not struggle. That's the message here. Exercising faith in the Lord's command to pay tithing. So I'm gonna read the highlighted section. Anybody who wants to pause this can read the rest. It says, one day I decided to borrow the tithe money that I was keeping to solve a problem. This was the biggest mistake of my life. Since that day, I have never been able to pay my tithe again, nor have I been able to pay back the loan to the Lord. It was the beginning of all of my misfortunes. I even had 2 surgical operations in 2 consecutive years.
Sorry.
I still had debts. I could no more save money. I was sick all the time. Then I realized that everything was related to my non-obedience to the law of tithing.
Oh my
Okay?
God. Yeah.
Yeah. Now this message, this is a Relief Society president in Africa who writes a message. The church takes this and puts it up on the website for everybody to consume. This is the key message. Pay it or suffer.
Yeah. And not just suffer monetarily, suffer health-wise. You might be desperately ill because you didn't pay your tithing. You may have to have surgeries because you couldn't pay your tithing. And that idea of back tithing and back debt. Yeah, this is very harmful and damaging, this kind of a message.
Yep. And then it says that later she says, finally she came back around to paying a tithing. Then I kept the faith without any resistance. I gave up. I gave up any autonomy I had, and I just paid. I began to pay a complete tithe. Since then, I have had no more difficulty in paying a regular and full tithe. My problems have also come to an end. I do not say that I am now wealthy, but I have good health and peace in my heart. I no longer have any debt, and whatever the situation I may find myself in, there is always a solution.
I think it's funny how the LDS church tends to sort of look down on other religions that have overt prosperity gospel. They kind of make fun of it. They say, who would fall for that? Who would do that? Look at them promising these things. This is identical.
This
I
is
don't know why
exactly
people
what it
can't
is.
see it.
Yep. And it's taking people who exist in scarcity
Yeah.
and doubling down on that, being like, you have to pay us or else this could be your outcome. This one, I laughed out loud when I read this one. This is the Lord had a plan. This is encouraging payment while this article actively mitigates expectations. So in the previous one, it was I lost
What title
everything.
is
I paid
that?
my
I'm
tithing.
sorry. It's just so funny to me.
Um, in the previous article, it was I took money from the Lord and I suffered. Everything went
Right.
wrong. I paid it back. Everything was great. This one is they pay tithing and things still suck, but they're happy
Mhm.
about it. So let's read this one. It talks about a family and it says their circumstances became very desperate. At one point, they had no food, and only money that they had in the house was money that they had set aside for tithing. It was fast Sunday that week, but they had no money for transportation to church. Despite their hunger, they set out to church more than an 8 hours walk away. They arrived and joyfully paid their tithing in full, telling no one of their plight. As they journeyed home, they were filled with happiness and gratitude that they'd been able to pay their tithing. They couldn't eat, they had no food, but hey, the church had that money in hand. God blessed them for their faithfulness. He did not send them more money or jobs or food, and their situation remained the same for several years. The miracle that they received during that time is the little food that they were able to obtain nourished them in such a way that they became healthier and happier despite their hunger. Okay, this is the magic
I
worldview.
was going to say it's a magical outcome. Of course
Yep.
it did. It's loaves and
Yep.
fishes. It's
Yep.
magic.
So yeah, they did. So basically, nothing changed. Nothing changed. The food that they got did not become more nutrient rich. Okay. It did not last longer in their stomach. It did not divide like fish is, right? Nothing changed. Okay. The framework in which the church conditioned them to view their plight changed, but their physical conditions were just as indigent as they were when they started giving their money to the institution.
Yeah, and this is
Um,
why Ensign Peak matters. These stories where people are giving their money,
yes.
and in the past we thought, okay, they're giving their money and it is helping others. It's not even helping others. This is why Ensign Peak matters, and it was so infuriating to find out that this kind of money from this kind of family, where is it? It's in a fund.
Yeah.
It's in
And see,
stocks.
these two slides are why we had to go through everything else because that's the message here. But when you get to the message in Africa, it is so much more clear. It is so much more straightforward. It's you're going to pay the money, you might not get anything back.
But you're going to
He
like
says
it. You're going to like not getting anything back. You're going to
you're going
have
to
a
be happy.
glow of
Yeah.
not getting anything back.
What is that statement? You will own nothing, but you will be happy.
Yeah,
Right?
that's it.
Conservatives are always so concerned about socialism. You will own nothing, but you'll be happy. The church literally has that same message.
Yeah.
It says people would often ask them what they were doing that made them glow with such good health. Others never knew that they were surviving on very little. Not knowing this, the family was happy, never felt ill or weak. God fed them in his own way, which means he didn't do a damn thing.
Right.
They gave money over and then they viewed their outcomes differently based upon a framework that the church told them to have. And frankly, I would be willing to say this is one of these things that didn't actually happen.
Oh,
Um,
I'm sure.
I think this is the final one. This is tithing, a blessing from Heavenly Father to help us on our mortal journey. I'm going to go ahead and let you read this one.
Do you want me to read the whole thing, all the paragraphs?
You read the first two, I'll read the last two.
Okay, perfect. Tithing, it's called Tithing, a blessing from Heavenly Father to help us on our mortal journey. Tithing is a commandment of God, and the test is to see if we love and trust our God enough to obey his commandments. Another test, so many tests. If we pass the test, By living the law of tithing, we will find all of the help our Father in heaven has provided for us. If, however, we choose not to keep the law, we will not receive the help he provided for us. Instead, we will learn the ways of the world, and those ways cannot bring us the blessings our loving Father in heaven offers us. God, it's so manipulative. Our
It's so
obedience
bad.
to the law of tithing shows whether we love and trust God more than anything or anyone else.
Yep. Okay. So the next part carries on to this. Tithing is one of the most important tests we face on our mortal journey because choosing to live that law makes such a difference in our lives and the lives of our posterity. If paying tithing, we prove ourselves to him, he will pour out blessings that there is not enough room to receive. But we know from the previous article, he's not going to give you more food.
No.
He's not going to give you better jobs. He's not going to do any of that stuff, but you're just going to view your situation differently. This, of course, includes opening the doors of the temple where heaven and earth intersect and where the blessings of eternity are made possible. So you're not going to get food. You're not going to get jobs. Your village isn't going to get better. Cholera is not going to go away. Your well might still dry up. But damn it, you are going to have some esoteric teachings from the 19th century that's going to tie everything together for you. Okay?
Right. And
When
this
we
is why they
consider-
say the temple alleviates poverty, which it doesn't. It just makes you have a different mindset and frame it
Correct.
differently.
Exactly. When we consider world without end, righteous posterity as sands of the sea, we can begin to understand what it means to receive blessings so great there is not room to receive them. Okay? One cannot no, okay, let's put this in context. We are talking to populations that have no concept of even long-term life expectancy, right? Of modern medicine, of the ability to put their feet up at night and know that in 6 months they're still going to be okay because they have a savings account or see their kids go to college. And you're telling them that the esoteric concepts of their posterity as sands of the sea is going to give them an understanding what it means to pay tithing? Okay? It says one cannot receive these blessings without receiving the ordinances of the temple and keeping the associated covenants, and no one can develop faith necessary to receive these blessings of the temple until they live the law of tithing. That is the message. You cannot receive something for which you have no tangible return that may or may not help your friends and family, that will not put food on your table, will not get you out of economic scarcity or terrorist warfare or ethnic cleansing or any of the things that actually happen in these countries. But you're going to pay us money so you can gain access to these concepts that are not verifiable. It's emotional feel-good-ism,
yeah,
but it's a con.
Well, and buying your way into heaven has been the mantra of Christianity, for centuries. That is what it takes. You must buy your way in.
Yeah. So when we take these presentations and we talk about redefining tithing as rent or a test or interest, the church converts what in the New Testament is free will giving into a non-optional financial obligation. You owe God simply for existing, which you didn't ask to do. None of us asked to be born. Now, unless you start going into the doctrine of pre-existence, right? And that's how they rationalize this. You chose with Job. Well, guess what? Job is not scripture. Job is dramatic literature. Okay? There's a whole other tangent for me, but you owe God for existing. Your body, your labor, the environment in which you operate, which you cultivate, the land at which grows your food is not yours. Failure to pay this rent is theft. You are taking from God what rightfully belongs to his. If it rightfully belongs to him, what? Poverty does not absolve the debt. So just because you're poor doesn't mean you don't have to pay. Okay? Why this benefits the church? Debt framing eliminates any form of consent. People do not evaluate whether they can afford it. They know that through legal obligations, debts must be paid regardless of economic hardship. Everybody has to pay their bills. Okay? This guarantees, like we've said before, institutional revenue. The church always walks away with a net win, whether it's a fractional amount or not. And it shields the church from any form of moral responsibility. Hardship becomes the spiritual problem of the tithing payer, not the economic extraction on behalf of the church, which leaves them less prepared and less able to meet these hardships. Okay. Whew. And it's especially abusive to the poorest of the poor. So
Yeah.
in extreme poverty, right, existence itself for
Yeah.
these populations is already precarious. So telling somebody that they must pay rent to God for air, water, and life exploits this
Existential.
existential fear, which already grips them in their everyday life.
Yeah.
It is gratitude manipulation. It is, oh, you love God, guess what? You have to give us the money. It creates a dependent psychology. If you don't pay, you lose what you could have, and you'll never know unless you pay. And for me, a God that requires rent for breathing is not a transcendent moral being. It is a very
Exactly.
human landlord mirroring earthly power structures, right? Not a intergalactic creator of all things who can make gold move from mountain to mountain, like Brigham Young used to say. If the Lord wanted to take care of these populations, and Brigham Young used to taught that he would take Porter Rockwell's mine, because people would go up in the mountains and try to look for it.
Yeah.
He's like, oh well, God is moving the resources because you're too greedy. If God wanted to help these people who were paying tithing, why wouldn't they strike oil? Why wouldn't they find gold? Well, we know why, right? One, because it's not there, and two, because it does nothing to solve the cultural corruption that surrounds these people. So if they did find oil, they would just be killed for it,
Yeah.
right? All right, so this is a shell game. Heads you lose, tails they win. Not enough faith, it's a struggle to test your faith. God acts in mysterious ways. You get the blessings on his own time. The church never fails in any of these calculations because it never specifies any kind of outcome. Okay? That is key. The church cannot fail in its messaging because it never specifies what it could fail at. If your outcome is positive, the church is is the window. If you prosper, tithing works for you. If you suffer, God is testing you. If nothing changes, the blessings are spiritual. If you doubt, you lack faith. If you leave, you forfeited your blessings. Okay, it's a shell game.
Yeah, and
It's
again, like you said, heads I win. It's the every time the church is always going to come out the winner.
it's a grift. It's a 100% grift. It's a grift because the blessings are undefined, the
Yep.
timing is undefined, the nature is undefined, and no falsifiable claim can ever be made on behalf of the institution. Yeah. All right. The church takes real money from those who can least afford it and makes theoretical promises and bears zero risk for the financial strife of any member. And that, to me, this is the crux of this whole thing. It's especially mean-spirited to do it to the poor. So this resembles a grift even more, okay? Structurally, not legally, right? People can say, well, why can't you just sue them and get your money back, right? Because accepting money for faith claims you know you can't deliver is unethical, but it's not illegal to be an asshole,
No,
right?
not at all.
So,
And this is proved over and over in the tithing lawsuits, right? I was talking to
that's
Landon
right.
the other day about a pastor or some kind of religious figure who was actually arrested because he was selling plots of land in heaven. Like you give him money and he gives you a deed for, a certain square footage that you'll have in heaven. And we're like, why would he be arrested? I mean, isn't that exactly what all the rest of this is? I mean, maybe not specifically a plot of land, but it's the same thing, something intangible later that you pay for now. And there is no protection. Like you said, if a company did this to you, you would have some recourse legally. But, if you're, I guess you could say, manipulated and you believe this other thing from a religion, there is no way. There's no help that you can get. It's protected.
Right. It's a 100% loss, right?
Yep.
So payment is mandatory for full institutional participation, and access to divine blessings and favor, right? There's even the talks that came out a couple years ago and I have a post on this somewhere, where church leadership was saying that there's special blessings. God has a special kind of love for those who keep their covenants, right?
Yep.
Rewards are, like I said, unverifiable and subjective. Outcomes are retroactively interpreted in favor of the institutional narrative. So if something happens, the church finds out about it, They are going to tell the story through the lens of the institution's narrative. So everything positive, retroactively, the church can take that as part of their success story. The responsibility is displaced on God. So instead of the corporation which collects the funds, it makes divine claims, and the institution always collects and is enriched regardless of any results from any individuals. The poor assume all the risk, and the church assumes zero.
Which to me, it's a treasure dig, right? It all kind of goes back to that. If you pay into a system, you expect something, and then, oh, I'm sorry, that treasure's gone. It's out of my hands. It's treasure guardian.
Yes.
I have no, responsibility here. It's always kicking that can of responsibility down the road to someone else while you benefit.
Yeah, well, yeah, exactly. So Joseph, for those who don't know what she's referencing, Joseph and his father would lead these treasure hunts, right? And they would prepare themselves, and they had incantations that they would do, and they would go out and they would dig in a specific spot.
And
Okay.
people would pay them to go on these digs. That's the
Yep.
thing. They came out ahead.
Yep. So the preparation, they would pay the money in. The money going in was the tithing these people were paying to Joseph Smith for the service that he was providing, right? For the theoretical concept that he was going to use magical rocks to find them money, and what they would get out would be greater than what they put in. Okay. This is a brilliant point. I'm so glad you raised this.
Everything's a treasure dig. I've decided.
Yep. So let's think of it in that concept. The church is telling you, if you pay us tithing, then we are going to go on a treasure dig, and we are going to, the Lord will lead us to whatever blessings you have. And then you get out to the tree or the stump or the hill Cumorah, and you start to dig, right? And people start to get frustrated. People start to get upset. All of a sudden, the money you put in still exists in the hands of the treasure seeker, but your lack of faith in the process, or your contention with another person in the party, offended the spirit, and you no longer get your outcome. Joseph is still enriched. You have lost everything because you weren't faithful enough.
Yeah. It's all back on you. You did something. Yep.
Religious guilt or manipulation. It is fear-based obedience. If you don't pay, look at what could happen to you. You could have all these bad things happen. It's victim-blaming theology. It is religious exploitation of the poor. It is unfalsifiable spiritual claims. It insulates the institution from accountability. And even if sincerely believed by leaders, and I think there are people who genuinely believe this, the effects remain ethically abusive. Even if your bishop genuinely thinks that this is true, the ethics of it are still bad, especially when applied to children, the hungry, and the global poor.
Yep.
All right. Especially harmful in poverty. So the church is asking for guaranteed, tangible, irreversible resources. You do not get this money back, cash or monetized goods, from people who live below the subsistence level of the poverty line, people who live below $3 a day, the poorest of the world's poor, while offering non-falsifiable, non-contractual spiritual rewards. At the core ethical problem is a poor family's money buys food, buys medicine, shelter, school fees. It has an immediate, quantifiable survival value. Okay? They know where and how far that money can go. It is non-replaceable once it is given. You cannot gain interest on it. You cannot apply it to your needs. It is gone. The church's promises for people giving over this resource that has immediate survival value cannot be measured, cannot be enforced, will not ever be audited. More importantly, their claims cannot be proven truly false because the responsibility for interpreting the claims is passed off on the people who now have a sunk cost fallacy. I paid it in there. I better rationalize what I'm getting out of it. This is an asymmetrical exchange in which all material risk is borne by the poor and the benefit accrues solely at the institution.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of pressure when you pay tithing to scrutinize your life to find a benefit, right? I mean, you do that overtly, and you also, I think, just do it mentally because you can't admit that maybe that wasn't the greatest decision to give away your resources. So you do work really hard to find something that's a positive and somehow that it worked. And then that becomes a faith promoting story. And then that just continues the narrative that everybody buys into.
Yeah. Now, I realize I've repeated myself on a couple of these slides, but I'm going to hit a couple of these thought points. We've already said the institution avoids accountability by never specifying outcomes. Okay. And that this entire system prioritizes church solvency over individual financial
Uh-huh.
well-being and even survival. This is not Christ-like because it is not what's in the best interest of the poor. I do not believe that if Christ is looking at indigent populations, he genuinely thinks that they need to be paying a whole bunch of money that they don't have to pay. He's going to look at what's in their best interest first, right? If Christ were present among the poorest of the poor in Africa, he would be feeding them, not billing them for access to blessings that are strictly nonsensical, in my
Can
opinion.
you imagine? Can you imagine Christ coming and saying, "You all owe me rent. Bring me your rent." I mean, it's just completely opposite of every message in the New Testament. And really, the widow's mite story, which they use all the time, that's very likely misinterpreted. That the priest should not even have asked something like that from someone like that. And yet it's
And the thing
used
is,
like a hammer, isn't it? The widow's mite. But look into that, everybody. Misinterpretation.
well, the worst part of that story is the worst part about the way that story is told is that woman was not required to pay a dime. That was what she was willing to pay. That was her own
Yeah.
free will in which she was
Yeah.
like, there, as far as I know in that story, there are no institutional perks attached to her giving that. That was of the goodness and the faith in her heart. And I am all about somebody who has a genuine faith saying, I am going to pay this out of faith. What I find morally repugnant is being told you have to pay this or else
Mhm.
you're going to suffer, you're going to lose, and we're going to gatekeep blessings from you
Yeah.
because, like we said, this is spiritual gatekeeping via financial obligation to divine ordinances. This was one of the straws on the camel's back for me because this is when I realized that the church had monetized the temple,
Mhm.
right? And people don't comprehend that. We've grown up our entire life with the idea that you have to pay tithing to get in. Tithing was not a variable for temple worthiness until like the beginning of the 20th century,
Yeah.
the end of the 19th. Okay. The church was in debt. They couldn't pay anything. Well, what could they withhold from people to ensure that people paid their tithing? Access to the temple. And so tithing payment becomes an element of requirement for entering the temple, not out of divine revelation, but through policy promulgation that says that you have to start paying this now as part of your interview process.
I
So
believe this is why they build so many temples. I've seen so many letters when stakes are going to get a temple, and included in all of those letters, fast, pray, fast offering, pay your tithing. You want to be able to attend. That's exactly what it is. If a temple comes to
yeah.
your town, you better damn well be a full tithe payer and be able to go. And they're going to promote
Well,
that.
it also goes back to this whole thing of the church knows that it has to provide something. Okay. It can't just provide lip service all of the time. So the temple building points more towards look at what we're giving you,
Yeah.
right? It is the church is a business, and businesses have to deliver to shareholders in one way or another.
Yeah.
This is placating the membership by saying, look at our growth, look what we're doing. By the way, look at what God's giving you for all this work, right? So tithing is explicitly tied to temple worthiness. It's tied to ordinances of salvation. It's tied to the eternal continuation of your own family and the concept of exaltation itself. Let's talk about this concept of family. If you are living in scarcity, or you are from a community where family is your heritage and your tradition going all the way back, to for an institution to come down and say, you cannot have access to this thing, which means the most to you, which gives you your sense of security, which gives you your sense of foundation, unless you access your family through us. Okay. What they are doing is they are holding hostage the very thing that gives people the most meaning. Um, and it creates a pay to access structure for it. So it ensures for the church a lifelong revenue stream from the richest people in Lehi to the poorest people in Africa, and converts this fear of eternal loss into a financial compliance in which the church always wins. This makes access to God conditional upon payment to the institution.
Now, I've even
And
heard
there's
rhetoric recently where they talk about, okay, so your children may have stepped away or your family members may have left, because this is a reality, right? As people exit
yeah.
Mormonism, you can basically sort of save their soul or make it more possible for them to be okay in the next life if you remain faithful and keep going to the temple. Well, what does that mean? If you continue to pay, you can actually somehow impact, the wayward children who have stepped away. So every time they say go to the temple, if you just add that monetary component to it, it just sounds so bad.
What I would be fascinated to see is if you take the average income in Utah, take the number of times that they go to the temple, and break that tithing payment down to the number of times you go to the temple, how much they're paying per visit.
Yeah.
Because that's what it comes down to.
It does.
Yeah.
You can't go if you have not paid. Yep. It's a fact.
And the wealthier are paying more for that option than the poor are, or the poor are paying more per capita on what they're actually making. So
yeah, and that's how it kind of trickles down. It's hard to see, but a wealthy person, it's nothing, to pay that tithe, and the lower your income goes, the more important that money would have been to you as a resource. And so it does matter. It's kind of a sliding scale.
So I'm going to close this out by talking about this will a man rob God? Okay, because this is one of the most quoted scriptures for all of this. Malachi 3:8-10 is not about Christians paying 10% of their income. It has nothing to do with that. And lying to the poor about it means you worship money more than you worship truth. So actively quoting this scripture all the time is convenient and manipulative, and people who actually understand scripture know this, but they allow the church to do it because it's a convenient message. Malachi is written in that post-exilic Israel period, about the 5th century BC, right? And it's specifically written in the system of the law of Moses. And the book echoes other comments in Nehemiah, which calls out priests and temple leadership for covenant violation. So Nehemiah is roughly contemporaneous, right? So you have these books that are calling out the priests, not the people paying money into the temple, right? For offering polluted sacrifices, for showing partiality in teaching the law, for profiting from corrupt worship, for failing to properly administer temple resources. This context matters because the tithes were not voluntary donations. These were a cultural tax that were used to support the Levites who did not own land. They were the people that officiated the temple. So the tithing supported the temple and the people who were in it. They supported temple operations, and more importantly, the tithings would go to support the poor every third year. Okay? So if the priests were taking money that had been paid in, they were actively robbing the poor, not the poor robbing God by not paying into it, right? So the key point that the church never talks about in this context is the priests were responsible for collecting, storing, and redistributing tithes, okay? Nehemiah 13 is the exact same era as Malachi, and it explicitly states that the tithing was being mishandled by the institution. The Levites abandoned temple service because they weren't being supported because of this, and temple chambers meant for tithes were being used improperly. And that means that this message of this charge of robbery logically includes corrupt religious leaders, not merely lay people, for failing to give enough. Right. It is a condemnation of leadership and the people who handled money, not the people who were paying into it.
So we should actually turn that onto the church and say, will you rob God? Because some of your practices are doing exactly that.
That's exactly. So that's what I'm saying here. Why the church misuses Malachi 3 to guilt people into tithing? Because it's rhetorically powerful. Yeah. Malachi 3 provides a divine accusation. You are robbing God. It has this fear hook, this curse versus blessings that we hear throughout. Avram Gilead used to talk about curses and blessings all the time. Covenant curses, covenant blessings, right? And a financial lever, right? Money unlocks God's favor. And that makes this passage extremely effective for this guilt-based fundraising, this prosperity theology, which we've talked about, and institutional self-preservation. When the institution starts running out of money, they can pull Malachi off the shelf, quote it out of context, and provide fear and guilt and a promise of something more to the people who pay in. But to use this scripture the way that they use it, you have to remove it from the context of Israel's covenant law. Yeah. This no longer applies, right? And ignore its priest leadership condemnation and convert an agricultural temple tax from the Bronze Age into a modern income exchange percentage and apply Old Covenant curses theology onto New Testament believers, which doesn't fit because, as we see from the way tithing is treated in the New Testament, it's completely different. So, removing the context reverses the direction of the rebuke in the text. So ironically, Malachi condemns religious leaders who are misusing God's systems, yet it is used by the church as a tool to shield leadership from scrutiny, places moral blame on the poor, and threatens loss of divine favor for non-payment. Okay, so when somebody quotes Malachi 3, you just point out that's not written the way that they're using it, and I think it's morally repugnant to do so.
Yeah.
So Jesus never commanded the church to tithe before or after the resurrection, right? So I like this. If you don't tithe, you're a thief and a robber. Hashtag stuff Jesus never said. Paul is explicit in this. Each one must give as he has decided in his heart, not reluctantly or under compulsion. So I would ask you, if you are being told that you will lose access to blessings, that you will not have access to God's divine favor, if you will not have access to your family, if you will not have access on the potentiality for anything else the church says they offer, is that compulsion or are you giving out of the goodness of your heart? If you are trained as a child that you have to give every single out of everything, are you actively giving because you are giving out of the goodness of your heart or because you are conditioned as a child to do so? Okay. This concept of not under compulsion directly contradicts this idea of mandatory percentages, guilt-based pressure, and this fear of divine covenant, divine punishment, which echoes from the wealthiest of the wealthy to the poorest of the poor.
Yeah, we all lived it, didn't it?
Is
Yeah, we all lived this. So
yes. So I think this is my last slide. I think, but if you'll read right there under gospel principles.
Let's see. Oh, the when we speak.
Yeah.
It says, when we speak untruths, we are guilty of lying. We can also intentionally deceive others by a gesture or a look, by silence, or by telling only part of the truth. Whenever we lead people in any way to believe something that is not true, we are not being honest. And that's from the Gospel Principles, chapter 31 on honesty.
Yes. So my contention here is that when church leaders use this passage from Malachi to manipulate and pressure the poor into paying tithing to the institution without providing the historical context, to influence and condition behavior, this is dishonest and it is unethical, and it represents the church using scripture to lie in its own self-interest. Okay? Malachi 3, 8 through 10 is not about Christians paying 10% tithing. It is a prophetic rebuke of a covenant violation and priestly corruption within a Bronze Age society. It is using guilt. It is used to guilt people into tithing. To use it to guilt people into tithing requires that you misquote it, that you decontextualize it, and you weaponize scripture for an institutional outcome. The New Testament never commands tithing and explicitly rejects coercive giving. And my contention is that when people are conditioned that they either give or they lose, that is coercion because it is cultural conditioning that they did not agree to. When the church uses Malachi 3 today, they often invert its meaning. It protects the institution while burdening individuals, especially the poor. Yeah, that's my last slide. So no tithing, no temple, no eternal family, no payment, no faith equals a spiritual exclusion. And this benefits the church, this entire system. It creates a pay to access salvation structure. It ensures lifelong revenues for the church itself. It converts fear of eternal loss into financial compliance. And it is morally indefensible because it makes access to God conditional on payments to a temporal institution. So that is, I think, all of my
mic
slides.
Drop. One thing I think is so interesting, and we're seeing this trend, right? I think Ensign Peak, the SEC, all of this made people more aware of financially what the church was up to, right? So you see people paying what they call designer tithing. And that is, I still believe in tithing. I believe in paying 10% of my income. I believe the scriptures, tell me that's important. I believe God wants me to do that. But I'm going to pay it where I want to pay it. right? I'm going to give it to charities of my choice. I'm going to pick things that I feel good about, and I think that kind of has the church scrambling a little bit, because then they almost have to say some things out loud. Oh, well, no, to us, we're Jesus Christ. When you say the church, think of Jesus Christ. We're Jesus Christ. But a lot of their rhetoric fits in exactly with you being able to pay where you want to. So it's an interesting thing. And you have some notables like, say, Jana Reese, who wrote a whole article in Religion News Service about, I'm going to pay where I want to pay. And I'm still a faithful Mormon. And so it's interesting how people are pushing back. And I think the church is scrambling a little bit because they have to kind of say it out loud. Oh, no, to us, right? Where they can't necessarily prove they are using it for the purposes mentioned in the scriptures, or what God would want you to do, which is helping others, where some of these other charities, you're like, yeah, I feel good about this, I see where my money's going. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, but I think that's interesting. And I've heard more than one faithful person say, and designer just means you kind of pick. Designer is kind of a negative term that I think apologists have come up with, but it just means you get to decide on your own terms where you want to contribute, which is how it should be. So I think that's kind of dangerous to the structure and to the threats, right?
I think the issue you raised there, okay, that exact trend is exactly why the language to the saints in Africa is so hardcore. It's so tied to that, because there they have a blank slate population that they can condition, whereas they're losing the narrative here. Like look at the reaction on garments, right? They were angry because those weren't supposed to happen. Right. So the message in the 80s or 70s when we started this presentation was very similar to what they get in Africa. Right. And so you have these populations there. They don't have what we have. They don't think the same way we think. So the church goes in there and presents these hard lines, this black and white. I didn't pay tithing. I lost my health and I couldn't pay anything.
It's threatening language. It's so very threatening that you're right. They don't do that in that same way in general conference or here. It's a little softened, it's a little more vague, but they're threatening those steps. You owe rent, you owe everything. Yeah, it's very harsh.
I think the presentation with Lindsay Robbins was a misstep. I don't think they calculated that language. They're used to using it in other contexts, and they used it here, and it blew up on them, right? But for me, going back and taking a look at, okay, this is what we hear here. This is what they're saying in Africa. If this was a divine institution that was led by a God that was really concerned with the ability of people to subsist and to thrive in life, then the blessings would come from the top down. The church has the ability to go into these countries and help like crazy, right? There's geopolitical issues at play every single time we look at this stuff, right? But they could do more. And I know people are like, oh, well, you shouldn't be telling the church what they can or cannot do. But when the church is taking 10% of the income of the poorest people in the world and then giving them a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of their income back in humanitarian aid and telling them how good they have it, I think that the church is using those populations basically to milk them for money and to promise them esoteric promises that the church has no requirement to actually deliver. And that's one of the bigger issues for me. It is immoral for any person in a position of power to say, I promise, when they are not personally responsible to deliver that promise. Right. If I look at my kid and I say, hey, I promise I will take you skating tonight. Okay. I have to deliver on taking her skating tonight, which I am. Okay. She asked me about today. Now, if I say, I'm going to take you skating and then I don't, that child has something that they can use back on me. It is a check mark. You did not deliver. But if you look at the rates that the church uses the term "I promise" in the last 10 years, it's skyrocketed. Since Nelson came to promises, if you pray, I promise you, go to the General Corpus of General Conferences and type in "I promise" and see where that language has skyrocketed. The church is promising what they know they can't, what they cannot deliver. And promises are loaded language. Granted, in the quotes we had in the presentation today, they did not use the word "I promise," but they used everything except that. They used prophetic authority to say he will give you more money, he will give you more jobs, he will give you the better to use your money. And then in a different context, it's you're going to pay it, but he's not going to give you this. They didn't get better jobs, they didn't get anything, but they felt spiritually happy about it. Tithing should never be a requirement for any aspect of religious participation. It should be something that people give of their own free will, that stays within their communities. It should not be hoarded back in Salt Lake. It should not be taken to purchase for larger businesses, and the
Or
accountability should
land,
be
real
100% open.
estate, right? I mean, that's the thing when you
Right.
really understand what they're doing with the money. But it's an intoxicating concept. And I remember I went to Joel Osteen once at the giant arena there in Texas.
Really?
You know, I did. It was like a show. I mean, from the time we pulled into underground parking, there were ushers there to help you in. If you were a woman, they took your arm and walked you down the steps. It was, three different bands. I mean, people don't, LDS people don't understand the level of production for some of these, but Joel Osteen's up there and he, he can speak. He doesn't need notes. He's just going on and on, but it is intoxicating in the things that he said. God knows you. He knows your health problems. He knows your monetary problems. He knows you need that job. He knows look, I'm channeling him right now. He knows
Yeah.
you're worried about your
I'm inspired.
son. He knows you're worried about your daughter. He knows your parents are failing and you need help. All you have to do, is, and that was it exactly,
Cut that
give
check.
to the Lord and he'll give, and I remember going, God, I feel like I want to write a check. This is amazing. It's wishful thinking. All human beings need that. You need somebody to recognize what your problems are. And he was listing out those exact things that the church is telling, those faith promoting stories. My health failed and then it got better. It's incredible. I lost the job. I got the job. People love that. They love a miracle. It's magical thinking. And when it doesn't happen because you wrote the check, must be something I'm doing. I'm not trying hard enough. I'm not faithful enough. I better write another check. And then your sunk cost, right? And we can understand how it happens. We're all just human beings, right?
And imagine how much worse it is when you're a population that lives in scarcity, that has never existed out of scarcity.
Exactly.
And so I find the messaging repugnant in the U.S. When I read that stuff from the Africa West website, I got just morally indignant. And I think people need to look at the articles. I left the article names up there. You can type them in. They will come up on a Google search. So take the quotes we have
we can
here.
put the links in the show notes too, because you're absolutely right. I don't know if people realize there is a West African, everything from Instagram to Facebook. It's very different from the message that they're sharing here. And I remember coming across, somebody shared it with me. It was a job posting for actors, right? The church puts out videos and things, and it was looking for people of color to be in a video about the blessings of tithing. So I know they're still doing this. They're going to show families who pay. They're going to, rehearse these stories like you just read, and continued manipulation of it's going to work out if you do pay. It's not going to work out if you don't. And they're going to target those new members of the church because that's what they were asking for in the video. Some people that would be relatable to where the growth is happening in the church in Africa. So
yeah, it's, that's all I've got to say about that. Hopefully people, if you haven't seen what's here, there's lots and lots more. This is just the beginning of it, but I hope that, you sit back and you can look at it and you go, okay. More importantly, you look at it and you go, okay, who benefits?
Yes.
At the end of the day, that's the biggest question. When it comes to people to a Western church extracting money out of individuals in West Africa, the church always benefits, and those poor populations get esoteric concepts of subject that are subjectively, identified. The church always wins. They always win, and these people will pay, $34 a year to the church. That's a huge amount of money for them.
Yep.
And if they leave the church, they are out that money. They will never see that money again. And that money most likely will not make its way back to Africa. That's the other portion of this. This is not like the Catholic Church, where the Catholic Church has a parish. The money paid in, the money stays in the parish.
Yeah, no, it doesn't.
Okay. Here, they're extracting, they are mining money from the Africans and taking it back to Salt Lake to put it God knows where. And you should be angry. And if you're a member of the church, you should sit back and say, okay, this is wrong because we have billions of dollars. The blessings should be pouring from the top down, not coming from the bottom up.
Yep.
So,
And they don't need the money. And think about, things that have been said in the past. There's a day where hopefully we won't have to pay tithing, right? Was it Joseph
yeah, I
Epstein?
didn't get into that. I have a whole other
We
presentation
can't
on
even,
that. Yeah.
that's a whole nother thing. But yeah, tithing is not what it was meant to be. That's the whole point. It has become this other thing, and it was not what it was meant to be. But
Well,
yeah.
it'll be fun. It'll be fun to get together next month in St. George. I'm sure we're going to have this conversation all over again.
I think we will too. Yeah. And this will air before Thrive. So I think we should put a little plug out. If anybody is on the fence about whether they want to go or not, it's going to be amazing. Jim's going to be there. I'm going to be there.
It's almost sold out.
It really is. And I don't know if everybody knows. So it's been at this like hotel for I've gone, I think the last 3 years it's been there. And this year they had to get a convention center because so many people want to come down there and experience all of it. And even that is almost sold out. So it's going to be
Nathan Hinckley was saying it's like over 600 people now. So it's almost sold out.
Yeah, it's going to be massive. I mean, it's going to be so fun. I know. I don't want there to be more people because I'm presenting. I'm kind of nervous, but I think it's going to be good. So, no, and it's just a fun time to meet everybody, and everybody just hangs out, and you run into people you haven't seen before. Maybe you've only connected with online, and then you can connect with them in person. And it's so community building, and you walk away from there with so many more connections, new friends, connecting with old friends. And it's amazing. So it's the weekend of the 20th, 21st and 22nd. So it's that Friday night it starts. Most of the stuff happens on Saturday, all the speakers. And then Sunday, that's when Mormonish is presenting and John DeLynn. And then everybody goes home, in the afternoon. Although I think I'm going to do a little Mountain Meadows excursion with, some people that haven't been there before. So you always have to stop there, right? If you really want a dose of it, that's another story, right? That's another intense thing. But
whole other podcast.
Yeah. Oh yeah. No, it's not your fun excursion, but it's important. So yeah. So everybody, come join us. I think it's going to be fantastic. And you're flying all the way you're really flying in.
I'll be in Friday night. Deb can't come. She has to stay on work. So I'll be in Thursday night.
Okay.
I have a friend of mine from high school who's coming down with me. My brother was going to come down, but he's not coming. All right. So yeah, we'll be down there, and I'll be with you guys, and talk to people, and I'll geek out myself and spend way too much money on books. Yeah, no, it's going to be fantastic, books and everything. So, cool. All right, everybody, awesome. Thanks for sticking with us on this tithing discussion and putting up with this kind of going. But it is frustrating, especially when you see what's happening in Africa. You're just like, oh my gosh, but that's where the growth is, and that's where, that's the next frontier, I guess. So I hope you guys have all been commenting. Please leave us comments on what you think about this whole tithing thing. It's such an infuriating issue. And, it just, I think maybe kind of speaks to what the organization really cares about, right? What its priorities really are. And it's maybe not the people in a lot of ways. Institutionally, I will say, local, different, institutional, yes. So please like and subscribe to Mormonish Podcast. And if you'd like to be made aware of when new episodes come out, you can hit the notification bell. You can always help support Mormonish Podcast with a donation. We do have links in the show notes to Donor Box, and we appreciate every single one of you that do this. It lets us, what does Mormonism Live always say? It keeps the lights on, right? I love that. But it does allow us to do everything that we do and have fantastic co-hosts on, like Unoriginal Jim. Should we call you UJ? Is that, maybe we need to like shorten. Oh, we could do that. Yeah, okay. That works.
I like that. Yeah, it's not OJ, thank goodness. It's UJ. Yeah. So I love it. Anyway, thank you so much for bringing us this presentation. I know you and I have been talking back and forth and ranting about it, but I think that you did a really good job, and just showing the quotes and showing why we're so frustrated, because we're not making this up. These are what they are saying to people. And you can imagine how the people are internalizing what they're hearing from their leaders, their trusted leaders. That's the thing. It's sort of an abuse of power. I can't stop talking about it. I'm going to stop now. All right. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you next time on Mormonish. Bye-bye.